You know, certain aspects of evolution may seem plausible even to Christians. We can imagine fish slowly turning into amphibians and adapting to life outside of water. But with a closer look at DNA, we see a different picture. It's like looking under the hood of a beautiful car only to find out that the engine's missing. We see that molecule-to-man evolution is virtually impossible. Coming up next on Origins, evolution, probable or problematic? Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name is Don Chapman, and it's my privilege to be your host. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science along with other important facts validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Our guest today is an international speaker and author, Seegert. He holds degrees in both physics and engineering. He currently serves as the co-founder and principal lecturer for the Creation Education Center. Jay, we are so thrilled you're here. It's just great to have you.
It's an honor to be on the show.
Well, we're thrilled you're here, and we want you to talk to us today about evolution. Is it probable or problematic? What do you mean by that?
Well, basically, certain portions of the evolutionary story seem plausible. It doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to buy into what we're told with certain portions of this story. But when you peek under the hood and see what has to go on inside, specifically with the DNA, that's when you start to see issues.
Well, I'm fascinated by that. So we're going to lift up the hood and look under there and see whether this really works.
Sure. For example, here, you can take a look at an Australian lungfish and a newt. These two creatures don't look completely different. There are similarities there. So again, it doesn't take that much imagination to envision these fins getting a little longer, a little stronger, and becoming legs, and then it learns how to walk up on the land and get better at breathing air. Just small little changes over time. Again, it seems plausible. Doesn't take that much imagination. But then when you specifically look at the DNA, what would have to actually go on inside to make these changes, that's when you realize there are huge problems. It's virtually impossible to happen.
So this couldn't have happened?
Couldn't have happened. The more we look at these things, the more we realize it's just not even plausible. It's really not probable. Then we've got Richard Dawkins, who you're very familiar with, one of the world's leading atheists, very outspoken evolutionist, a fairly intelligent scientist. He stated that you cannot be both sane and well-educated and disbelieve in evolution. The evidence is so strong that any sane, educated person has got to believe in evolution. Very dogmatic statement, very intimidating to a lot of people.
It really is, and it's also a very arrogant statement. I mean, he's basically saying, if you don't think like me, you're either not educated or you're not sane. That's not the way to have an open debate.
Sure, and it intimidates a lot of students when their professors or teachers make a statement like this. They're not sure how to respond because if they say they don't believe in evolution, they're considering themselves to be one of these crazy people.
Well, you've got some great information for us. Why don't you go up to the screen and share it with us?
Well, the long story short with evolution is that we start out with a single-celled organism, which how that came about is another topic that you've probably covered on your show already, but you've got to change a single-celled organism all the way into a human being, they say, over maybe almost 4 billion years. That's a big, big change. Well, we do see changes in nature. We see them all the time, and there are two basic types of change. You have built-in variations and random mutations. And built-in variations have to do with the genes in the DNA, and it's somewhat predictable because we're learning more and more about these genes and the DNA, so we kind of know what to expect with that. The random mutations, which we'll get into, that's unpredictable because they are actually copying errors, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen with that. Starting out looking at the built-in variation, it can produce quite a variety. So when we're looking at dogs, for instance, we see lots of different varieties of dogs today, and these are produced by the genes that they have, a nice variety. It can account for quite a bit. In fact, today, dogs, dingoes, coyotes, and wolves can all breed together because they're generally the same kind of animal. The book of Genesis tells us over and over that God created his creatures to reproduce after their kind. And that's what we see in biology. For example, you can breed a dog and a wolf, and you get a wolf dog. It's not that much of a surprise. It looks a little bit like the dog, a little bit like the wolf. But what you can't do is breed a dog and a wolf and end up with something like an ostrich because they don't have genes to make feathers and beaks and things like that. So we don't expect that to happen. But this is how evolution supposedly works, and this could be typically taught in a public high school system or a state university. We've got an organism up there, and it's going to reproduce. So it literally will copy its DNA and pass it on to its children. So the children come out looking pretty much like the parent because it's a copy of the same DNA. Then the children can reproduce, they copy their DNA, pass it on to the grandchildren, and the grandchildren look pretty much like the parents, and the grandparents, again, it's a copy of that same DNA. Then the grandchildren will reproduce, and all of a sudden we got a problem. We have some significant mutations going on here. Again, these are accidental copying errors, but they tell us that some of them are bad, and some of them are actually fairly good. Then the story goes that natural selection comes along like a superhero and wipes out all the bad ones, but it keeps the good ones. And then reproduction continues, and so we have the new ones reproducing, so we have more of the new ones, and then we have more of the original ones going on. And this continues on for millions and millions of years. And you can imagine the great variety we might have on this planet with a process like this. And I guarantee you that the students sitting in this class, they see this and they say,
Makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense. Can't argue with that. Even the Christian students, they see this and they say, well, I guess they've proven evolution. It makes sense to me. Maybe evolution is true. Maybe God used it. Maybe the Bible's wrong. I'm not quite sure because it seems so straightforward.
Mutation, natural selection, that makes it work.
That's right. Can't argue with that, they think.
Uh-huh.
We're going to take a closer look at these mutations.
Okay.
Can these accidental copying errors really account for the molecules to man evolution that they're teaching? Now, here's an analogy here. Let's say the amount of information in a single-cell bacteria is about the amount of information in a biochemistry textbook, because that's reality, that's what we see. But remember, we've got to change this single cell all the way into a human being. So we can't just keep it with this amount of information. We've got to change it and increase that information. Well, here's a picture of the textbook, one of the pages, and here's some of the text from that page. If we were to simply copy this page over and over and over perfectly, millions of years from now, we would just have a lot more of these textbooks. So we can't just copy it perfectly. We've got to make changes. Well, what are those changes? Well, the changes are the mutations we've been mentioning, these accidental copying errors. And here are some examples. We have a duplication mutation. That's where you duplicate some information. In this example, I've duplicated the letter T in the word the. It doesn't spell the anymore. So when your genes are looking at that, it says, I don't recognize this anymore. It can't read it. Then we have a deletion mutation. That's where delete the E in energy here. It doesn't spell energy anymore. And then lastly here, we've got a substitution mutation. We take the N out of electron and put a Y in there instead. It doesn't spell electron anymore.
So mutations, by their very nature, make it weaker or less, not better.
Sure. They're basically detrimental, and most evolutionists will admit the vast majority of mutations are detrimental. They're making things worse. And it's pretty clear for us to see this. You're not going to create wings by messing up existing information. But the challenge for evolution gets worse than that. We're looking at the surface here. We're going to look at some detailed information here, looking at the DNA itself to see how the information is stored there. So let's say we're looking at a segment of our DNA. We're reading it, and it says, was it a rat I saw? Kind of a strange phrase here. Let's clean this up, take the punctuation away, write it on the screen. When we read in English, we read from left to right. But you may have already noticed you can actually read this backwards, right to left. Was it a rat I saw?
Oh.
It's called a palindrome. It goes forwards and backwards. This is what we've discovered about much of our DNA. Much of it can be read not only forwards, but also backwards.
Wow.
But the challenge for evolution gets worse than that, because that was the same piece of information. Take a look at this example here. You have the word desserts here. We flip this around, and it spells stressed, which is what I get when I don't get desserts.
Yeah.
So let's introduce a random mutation here. We'll just randomly delete the T. We'll notice it no longer spells desserts, but it also doesn't spell stressed either.
Right.
One random mutation messed up both messages forwards and backwards. But the challenge for evolution is worse than that, because we don't see little words in our DNA that flip back and forth. We see actually up to entire chapters of information that can be read forwards and backwards.
It's amazing how complex.
It is amazing. And here's a realistic example so people can grasp this a little bit better. Let's say that you had a job at a factory, you worked for a smartphone company, and it's your job to write the instruction manual to give to the manufacturing plant to make the phones. So your boss comes to you one day and says, I have a project for you. I need you to write the chapter in the manual that explains how the phones are going to download apps from the web. You say, okay, I can do that. Your boss is walking away, and then he turns around and goes, oh, wait a minute, forgot one minor detail. When you write your chapter that explains how to download apps from the web, you have to write it in such a way that if we read it backwards, it's going to explain how the phone's going to play music files. And you're thinking, okay, you're just kidding, right? He says, no, I'm serious. We only have so much room in the manual. You've got to do this. Well, that's humanly impossible. You can't even program a computer to do that. I did computer programming for about 18 years. It cannot be done. But this is what we're seeing in our DNA. You read certain segments, one direction, it creates certain proteins that carry out a certain function in your body. You read it backwards, it creates a separate set of proteins, completely different, carrying out different functions, forwards and backwards. But the challenge for evolution...
No wonder that guy has a headache.
It gets worse than that.
Yeah.
Here's a strange phrase. I like chocolate later that evening. Why is it strange? Because it's actually two phrases. We've got I like chocolate, which is true, and then we have later that evening. And they overlap in the middle, L-A-T-E. So what we have here is we introduce a random mutation again. We change that E into an H. What happens is it messes up both phrases. It doesn't spell I like chocolate, and it doesn't spell later that evening either. One random mutation messed up two messages. We actually have up to entire chapters of information in our DNA that overlap, not just a few letters, but entire chapters. But the challenge actually gets worse than that. We have spliced information. Here's that same phrase again, I like chocolate later that evening. Let's take some segments here, underline them, and bring them down below. And it spells, I like her hat. And this is what we see in our DNA. You can splice information, go to different places in the genome, take out a little random section in a sense, put them together, and you got a separate set of information. If we introduce another random mutation here, delete the H up there, it doesn't spell I like chocolate, but it also messes up the splice message. It doesn't spell I like her hat. Again, one random mutation messes up multiple messages here. And we actually see long sentences and short paragraphs that are spliced from different places and put together to give additional information in the DNA. But as you might imagine, the challenge gets even worse than that. We have embedded information in our DNA. It says, can you show Mike Olson checks from Oliver's labeled fax and set it on Herb's desk? Let's circle every ninth letter here. And when we bring those down below, it spells chocolate. Kind of a theme going on here. Let's make another random mutation. We will just delete the W there. What that would do is that would shift all the letters after that over one spot. So now the ninth letters are these, which doesn't spell anything. So again, one random mutation messes up the main sentence here, but it also messes up the embedded information. But one more time, it gets worse than that. We actually have encrypted messages in our DNA.
We are back, and we're talking about how mutations, really it's a little more complex than we think when we look at the whole DNA thing, and how it makes evolution seem less and less likely, a lot more problems than we thought. Now, before we get to data encryption, would you go back and just, Jay, bring us up to date on how deep the hole's gotten up until now?
Sure. Information structured on DNA, we've covered the fact that we can read messages forwards and different messages backwards. There's overlapping messages. There's spliced messages, so you get the regular message, plus you just take different chunks in different places, put them together, you get another set of information. And then we have embedded information, and then now we're getting to the encrypted information.
Well, I'm fascinated. Tell us about data encryption.
Sure. I actually had 2 interviews with the CIA to work in their cryptographic analysis division. Another story for another time, but we have a phrase going across the screen here. It doesn't seem to make any sense. But let's say you found out there was actually an encryption key, meaning this. Everywhere there's an H up there, it's really an A. And everywhere there's a B, it's really a C, and so on. In fact, everywhere you see a Y up there, there's 2 places. Those Ys are really T's. So when we substitute all those letters with the encryption key, we find out that this phrase spells out, this is an encrypted message.
Okay.
And that's one way of doing data encryption. Well, this is what we're seeing in the DNA. So you've got regular information in there, and then when you do substitutions, you have an additional message. Now, what's really interesting about this is let's take a second to figure out what would be required to create an encrypted message system. Well, we start out with this. First, you have to be able to develop a language system using symbols. So, okay, let's say we had 3 sticks like this, 3 lines, and we say when we arrange them this way, that's going to be an A. And then we've got 3 shapes here. When we put them together this way, we're going to call that a B. You have to create an entire alphabet by random motions in nature, particles smashing together, keeping in mind again that evolution, as they teach it, they don't say that God is doing this and doing that. It's just kind of nature doing what it does. So particles smashing together have to somehow create an alphabet system. Secondly, we have to be able to create and define words. So when we put these 4 letters together, it's going to represent this object here. You have to create an entire dictionary of words. Well, how do random particles smashing together create dictionaries with definitions? That's a required step. Third one, you have to be able to write meaningful sentences and paragraphs. Well, that requires rules of grammar. How do random particles in nature smashing together create rules of grammar? That's not going to happen, but it's another required step. And fourthly, you have to be able to establish the encryption system with the keys. So somehow particles smashing together do the encryption key that you're going to need. Then after that, you have to be able to develop the ability to read and carry out these instructions. Or the whole thing is impossible. It's just not going to happen. So again, how do random processes of nature create this? I don't know a scientist on the planet who could even begin to address how this would happen. Yet this is what we're seeing in the DNA. There's encrypted messages. So it's just not looking good. But the challenge continues for evolution. It gets worse than even that, everything we've covered. We actually have 3D information. This one's a little bit harder to depict. But the DNA, when it makes proteins, and proteins carry out all the functions in our body, it has to fold them. If proteins don't fold just right, kind of a lock and key mechanism, they're useless. They usually get disassembled and the parts are reused again. So proteins get folded into a very specific 3D format. So I'm going to put 7 words across the screen here. And what we're going to do is we're going to fold these words here by stacking them. And when we stack these words this way, you'll see kind of in somewhat of a 3D fashion here, going up and down, we see the word success. Now, if we were to make random mutations to this by changing the letters, deleting letters, substituting letters, or not stacking it the right way in a 3D fashion, we lose that message there, success. So again, it's another way of these random changes messing up existing information and then the embedded information and overlapping information, backwards information, and here, the 3D information. And so, as we're kind of concluding here, what we see is that even though certain things look great from a certain angle or a certain distance, like this bright red BMW, and again, you envision opening the hood and seeing a beautiful engine there, we've seen that with evolution, the engine is missing. There's really nothing
there at all
to drive this.
Jay, I just got to, what you've laid out here seems to make it mutation an impossible channel for evolution to happen. There's way too much here to be overcome or to be explained away. So suppose that instead of you sitting there, Richard Dawkins was sitting here talking to me, and he had just heard you presenting that. How would he explain that? He says it's so obvious that we're either crazy or uneducated. As an educated, sane man, how would he refute what you've just presented?
Well, you couldn't refute it directly. This is very powerful evidence, but that doesn't mean that someone would say, "Oh, I didn't know that. Can I come to church and worship Jesus with you?"
No.
They would just probably become more upset, respond more emotionally,
call you more names.
Elephant hurling large statements like, "Well, evolution's a fact. It's been proven. We see it all the time. All the scientists believe it. Evidence from every area of science backs it up," without directly addressing the specific issue.
And yet there's always this mask, and this is for our college students, there's always this mask that we're the ones doing the objective science, and those crazy Christians over there, they just don't get it. You've done a tremendous job for us. Thanks so much for sharing with us. Folks, we've been really blessed to have Jay with us today and for him to share the incredible complexity of this whole business of DNA and how mutations really can't be the change agent. It seems to make evolution a lot more problematic than probable. I hope that the next time someone just tells you that evolution's a fact and that you're crazy if you don't believe it, that you'll think about this show and realize that the evidence is really on our side. And never forget this, my friend. It's God's view that He created you. And that should always be your worldview as well. God bless you. I hope to see you again here soon on Origins. And until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program Number 1504, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.